I came home on a Thursday because of a storm. If the weather had held one more day, my wife would be dead, and my son knew exactly how long she had left. My name is Leonard Kowalski. I'm 57 years old. I manage a building supply warehouse outside of Millhaven, Ohio. Before that, I welded for 20 years. My hands still look like it. I'm not a lawyer, not a detective, not someone with connections or a plan. I'm just a man who got lucky with the weather and then spent the next 2 weeks making sure that luck counted for something. Every year in October, me and my buddy Arnold Briggs drive up to Lake Kiever for 3 days. We've done it since 2003. Arnold owns an auto repair shop about 2 miles from my house. I've known him longer than I've known most of my family. We don't talk much up there. We fish. We drink bad coffee. We watch the water. That's the whole trip. That's why it works. This year, a storm system came through Wednesday night. By 6 in the morning Thursday, we'd both checked the radar and agreed it wasn't worth the drive. Arnold called it first. I said, fine, see you next week. Packed my gear back in the truck bed and figured I'd surprise Gloria by coming home early. I tried calling her to let her know. She didn't pick up. She'd been sleeping in lately, said she'd been tired. Her joints had been bothering her, said she wasn't sleeping as well. We'd chalked it up to age. I stopped at the diner on Route 9 and ate breakfast. Took my time. Got home around 11. Stuart's car was in my driveway. Stuart is our son. He's 27. He and his wife Nadine have an apartment about 15 minutes from our house. Stuart doesn't drop by without calling. He barely shows up when we specifically invite him. Holidays are a negotiation. So seeing his gray Accord in my driveway on a Thursday morning, no warning, no text, that was the first knot in my stomach. I sat in the truck for maybe 30 seconds, just looked at that car, the cracked side mirror he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. Then I grabbed my jacket and went inside. Stuart was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter next to the coffee maker. Nadine was at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. The kitchen smelled like the candle Gloria keeps on the windowsill. Morning light came through the curtains above the sink. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. Stuart looked up when I walked in and said, "Hey, Dad," just like that. Flat, calm, like I'd told him I was coming. I was supposed to be at Lake Kiever for 3 more days. He knew that, and he didn't flinch. Not a blink, not a single trace of surprise on his face. Nadine looked up too. She smiled. The kind of smile people put on when they've already decided what they're going to say. I said, "Where's your mother?" Stuart cleared his throat. Said she'd had a rough night. Said she was disoriented when she woke up. Couldn't get her balance. Seemed confused. He'd come over to check on her. He didn't say why he'd been checking on her on a Thursday morning, and I didn't ask and found her in bad shape. Called an ambulance. She was at Mercy General. He said she was stable. He said it the way you say something you've rehearsed. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I was in the driveway and then I was pulling into the Mercy General parking lot with no memory of the 12 minutes in between. Dr. Paulette Nash met me at the nurses' station on the 2nd floor. She's a compact woman, mid-50s, gray at the temples. The kind of doctor who looks you in the eye the whole time she's talking. Doesn't use extra words. I appreciated that more than I can say. She told me Gloria had been brought in with severe disorientation, signs of significant organ stress, and elevated toxicity markers in her blood work. She said the pattern wasn't consistent with a sudden illness. She used the word building, said it looked like something that had been building over time. I put my hand flat on the counter, felt the cold surface under my palm. I looked at Dr. Nash and said, "Are you telling me someone did this to her?" She held my eyes and said, "I'm telling you we need more answers, and I think you do too." I went in to see Gloria. She was at the end of a corridor, hooked up to 3 monitors, an IV line in her left arm. The room smelled like antiseptic. The blinds were half open, and the light was thin and flat. Gloria spent 22 years as a nurse in this same hospital 2 floors up. She retired and started cooking meals for neighbors going through hard times. She has opinions on everything and she'll tell you all of them. Seeing her in that bed, smaller than I'd ever seen her, I'm not going to describe that in detail. Some things you keep. I sat down beside her, took her hand, told her I was there and I wasn't going anywhere. Then I walked back out to the waiting area. Stuart and Nadine had arrived. They were sitting on a couch near the window at the end of the waiting room. Stuart had his arms crossed. Nadine had her phone face down on her knee. Nadine is never without her phone. I'd watched her scroll through it during Thanksgiving Grace last year. A face-down phone meant she was either expecting something she didn't want me to see, or she'd already received it. I pulled a chair over and sat directly across from them. I didn't say hello, I said. "Which tea was it?" Stuart said, "What?" "Your mother has been drinking herbal tea every night for the past few months. Tea you've been bringing her. Which brand, where did you buy it, and what's in it?" The waiting room was quiet except for the PA system down the hall and the low hum of a TV mounted in the corner that nobody was watching. Stuart looked at Nadine. Nadine looked at the floor between her feet. That exchange lasted about 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all I needed. I said, "Go home, both of you." Stuart started to say something. I said his name the way my own father used to say mine when I was about to do something I couldn't walk back from. One word. Stuart closed his mouth. He stood up, and Nadine stood up with him, and they walked out through the double doors at the end of the corridor without another word. I watched until the doors swung shut behind them. Then I sat back down in that plastic chair, pulled out my phone, and opened our bank account. I want to be honest with you, I'm not comfortable with online banking. Never have been. I use it because I have to, not because I trust it. But I know how to read a column of numbers and ask whether they make sense. What I found over the next hour, sitting in that waiting room with bad hospital coffee going cold on the table beside me, was a pattern of withdrawals going back 5 months. Small amounts, $200 here, $175 there, $310 one week, $240 the next, $195 after that. The kind of numbers that don't announce themselves. They just sit there in the statement looking unremarkable, looking like gas money or a grocery run or any of the 100 small things that drain an account in the ordinary course of life. When I added them up, they came to just over $11,000 from a joint household account that Stuart had limited access to, emergency access. We called it when we set it up years ago, the kind of thing you do when your kid goes to college and you want him to be able to reach you financially if something goes wrong. He had used it like a slow drain, pulling just enough at irregular intervals to stay invisible. Someone had thought carefully about the amounts. Someone had done the math on what would and wouldn't trigger an alert. I sat with that for a while. Then I called Arnold. He picked up on the first ring. I told him everything the hospital, what Dr. Nash had said, the word building, the look on Stuart's face when I walked through the door, the tea, the 3-second look he'd given Nadine, the $11,000. Arnold listened without interrupting. That's one of the things I've always valued about him. He doesn't fill silence just to fill it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Leonard, gradual means deliberate. You understand that?" I said I did. He said, "Someone sat down and thought about how to do this without getting caught." "That's not a mistake. That's a plan." I said, "I know what it is." He said, "What do you need from me?" I told him I'd know more tomorrow. I told him to sit tight. I hung up and went back to sit with Gloria for a while. She was still sleeping. The monitors beeped with the steady patience of machines that don't know what's happening around them. The room was dim. The hallway outside quiet except for the soft footsteps of a night nurse passing every so often. I sat in the chair next to my wife's bed in the dark and I did not sleep, Doctor. Nash found me the next morning in the waiting room, looking, I'm sure, like a man who had spent the night in a plastic chair. She sat down beside me. Doctors don't usually do that. I noticed it and I appreciated it. She said the full panel had come back. Gloria had elevated levels of a compound consistent with long-term heavy metal ingestion, repeated, consistent exposure over several months. Her kidneys were under serious stress. They had started treatment. Dr. Nash looked at me steadily and said they had caught it, that Gloria had a strong chance of full recovery. Then she said that if Gloria had gone another 72 hours without treatment, her kidneys would not have survived. 72 hours. I asked how someone would do it without the person knowing Doctor. Nash said it could be introduced through food or drink, particularly through something like a powder-based supplement dissolved into a hot liquid. Something that dissolves completely and leaves no taste, no smell, no reason to suspect anything at all. Hot liquid. Every evening. The tea Stuart had been bringing over for months, ever since Gloria mentioned her joints were bothering her. He'd shown up one evening with a box and said he'd read it was good for inflammation, said he'd been thinking about her, said he wanted to help. I stood up, thanked Dr. Nash and walked to the window at the end of the corridor, stood there looking down at the parking lot for about a minute. A woman was loading grocery bags into a minivan. A man in a blue jacket was walking toward the entrance with his hands in his pockets. Ordinary Thursday morning. Nothing about it knew what I was standing there holding. Then I took out my phone and called Carolyn Pike. Carolyn Pike has practiced civil law in Mill Haven for 30 years. Her office is on the second floor of a building on 4th Street above a dry cleaner. Small waiting room, 2 filing cabinets, a desk that's seen better days. People who don't know her tend to underestimate her because of that office. She knows it and she doesn't mind one bit. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she was quiet for a few seconds. Then she said, "Leonard, do not touch anything in that house. Do not confront Stuart. Do not call him angry. Don't post anything. Don't hint at a single thing. Can you do that?" I said yes. She said, "Good, because when this lands, I want it to land completely. No cracks, no exits. You go back to that hospital and you act like a worried husband. Because right now, that is exactly what you are. She was right about that last part. Here's what I did for the next 5 days. I sent Stuart normal texts. Things like, "Mom's holding steady, doctors say a few more days. Thanks for checking in." He texted back short replies. "That's good to hear. Let me know if you need anything." The kind of messages a person writes when they're performing concern but have other things on their mind. I read each one and typed back something plain, and I put my phone in my pocket and went back to sitting with Gloria. While I was doing that, things were moving. Arnold drove out to a pharmacy 2 towns over. We'd identified it based on Dr. Nash's description of the specific compound and a short list of supplement brands that matched. Arnold spent 10 years doing security work before the auto shop, and he still knows how to have a quiet conversation with someone who has access to camera footage. Within 48 hours, he confirmed that Stuart had visited that pharmacy 3 separate times over 4 months, always paying cash, always alone, except the 3rd visit, when the exterior parking lot camera caught Nadine sitting in the passenger seat of the Accord, waiting. 3 visits. Cash each time, 2 towns over from where they lived. Carolyn pulled the full bank records and laid out every withdrawal with dates and amounts. The pattern was exactly what I'd suspected, but seeing it documented was something else. The amounts varied just enough, stayed just small enough. Never the same number twice in a row. Someone had researched what thresholds triggered automatic alerts and stayed deliberately underneath them for 5 months straight. Then Arnold connected me with a contact at the county records office, and that's where we found the piece I hadn't known to look for. 6 weeks before Gloria ended up in that ICU, she had visited an estate attorney in Columbus alone, without telling me. I want to be clear about what that meant. Knowing Gloria, it meant she was building something she wanted to present finished, not in progress. Gloria doesn't share half-formed plans. She shows you the completed thing and says, "Here's what I did." What she'd done was update her life insurance policy. The original policy had Stuart listed as secondary beneficiary, something we'd set up years ago without much thought, standard paperwork when he was still a teenager. Gloria had gone to that attorney to change it. She was removing Stuart entirely. Everything was being redirected to a literacy foundation she'd been quietly building for 2 years. Educational programs for kids in the county who didn't have much. She'd never mentioned it to me because she wanted to walk in one day and say, "Here's what I built, here's the whole thing." That was Gloria's way, never half measures. The policy was worth $1.2 million. Stuart had found out. I don't know exactly when or how. It doesn't matter. What matters is that he found out his mother was weeks away from finalizing paperwork that would cut him out of $1.2 million. And instead of picking up the phone, instead of driving over and sitting at that kitchen table and talking like a grown man, he and Nadine sat down and decided the most practical response was to make sure Gloria didn't live long enough to sign the final documents. The estate attorney had a 30-day processing window. Gloria had gone in 6 weeks before she collapsed. She was inside that window when the ambulance came. I was sitting in my truck in the hospital parking lot when Arnold called and told me all of it. I sat there with the engine off, and I let the full weight of it settle, the shape of it, every piece fitting against every other piece, until there was nothing left to wonder about. Then I started the truck and went back inside. On the 2nd day, Gloria opened her eyes. I was in the chair beside her when it happened. She blinked a few times, looked at the ceiling, then turned her head and looked at me. Her voice came out rough and low. She said, "Leonard, you look terrible." I laughed right there in the ICU. The nurse at the door glanced in. I didn't care. I leaned forward and said, "You're hooked up to 3 machines and you're critiquing my appearance." She said, "Someone has to." I held her hand and didn't let go for a long time. I didn't tell her everything yet. She needed to get stronger first, but I told her she was safe. I told her I knew what had happened. I told her everything was being handled. She looked at me for a moment with those eyes that have always been able to read me straight through. Then she said quietly, "It was Stuart, wasn't it?" Not a question. A statement I didn't answer. I held her hand a little tighter. She closed her eyes and said, almost to herself, "I always knew that boy had the worst of both of us and none of the best." I sat there and didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would have helped. There was one more detail that came in before the 5 days were up. Stuart, in what I can only describe as a breathtaking act of carelessness for a man who had otherwise been patient enough to poison someone over 4 months, had called the estate attorney's office. Posing as Gloria's personal assistant, asking about the status of the policy update, he left a callback number, his own personal cell phone number. When Arnold told me, I stared at the windshield of my truck for a solid 10 seconds. Then I said, "Arnold, did I raise a criminal mastermind or a complete idiot?" Arnold said, "Brother, somehow the answer is both." On day 5, I called Stuart. I kept my voice exactly the same as every other call that week, tired, a little worn down, nothing alarming. I told him I had some insurance paperwork for the hospital bills that needed a second signature, and asked if he and Nadine could come by the house to help me sort through it. Said it was easier in person. He said sure, said they'd be there in an hour. Carolyn had filed everything that morning, the pharmacy receipts and camera footage, the full bank records with every withdrawal documented and dated, the estate attorney's records, and the phone log showing Stuart's personal cell number on the incoming call. Dr. Nash's complete toxicology report. Every piece organized, cross-referenced, and submitted. I was standing at the kitchen window when Stuart's gray Accord pulled into the driveway. Same car. Same cracked side mirror. He'd never gotten around to fixing. He got out first. I noticed he was carrying something, a small potted plant, the kind you bring when you're playing the role of a concerned son navigating a difficult family situation. Nadine came around from the passenger side. She had her phone out before she'd fully closed the car door. They came up the front porch steps. I heard the knock. I walked to the door and opened it. They came inside. Stuart set the plant down on the little table by the door where Gloria keeps her keys. He looked at me with an expression that had a lot of rehearsal behind it. Tired concern, filial worry, a son doing his best in hard circumstances. Under different circumstances, it might have been convincing. I said, before we get to the paperwork, I need to tell you something. Stuart said, sure, what's up? I said, the police are outside. The color left his face so fast it was almost something to observe clinically. He said, what? I said, Carolyn Pike filed everything this morning. The tea, the pharmacy 2 towns over, 3 visits, cash, the 3rd time Nadine was in the car. The $11,000 pulled from the household account over 5 months in amounts just small enough to avoid alerts. The call you made to the estate attorney's office from your own cell phone, Dr. Nash's full toxicology report. All of it. Nadine made a sound I won't try to describe. Stuart opened his mouth. I held up one hand. I said, there's not a sentence in the English language that covers what you did. Don't try. He looked at me for a moment. I looked back. 27 years I'd known that face. I'd been in the delivery room when it came into the world. I'd sat up with it through fevers and bad dreams and the particular misery of being 13 years old. I'd worked night shifts for 3 years so the person behind that face could go to a college he walked away from in his 2nd year without ever calling to tell me why. I didn't say any of that. There was no point. Stuart walked out the front door and 2 officers stepped forward from where they'd been waiting at the edge of the porch. He was still holding the strap of the small bag he'd brought in with him. Nadine followed and went quiet in the way of someone who is already calculating what comes next and whether cooperation changes the math. I didn't watch. I turned back into the house, walked down the hall to the kitchen, and sat down at the table. The candle on the windowsill above the sink had burned down to almost nothing. The morning light came through the curtains the way it always does. The house was very quiet. I stayed there for a while. The trial lasted 11 days. Stuart's attorney worked hard on intent and causation. Carolyn worked harder on the 5-month pattern of withdrawals that never repeated the same amount twice and never crossed the alert threshold, which she argued successfully demonstrated not just intent, but careful premeditation. The jury came back in 4 hours. Stuart and Nadine were convicted on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and financial fraud. The sentences were significant. I'm not going to put numbers to it. Any number I say will feel like it falls short, and I'm done trying to make inadequate things sound like enough. Gloria came home on a Saturday in October. Arnold drove us back from Mercy General. The day was clear and cold, the kind of Ohio fall morning where the light hits everything at a low angle and the whole county looks like it's been freshly painted. She walked in through the front door and stood in the hallway, looked at the walls, the staircase, the kitchen at the end of the hall. Just looked the way you look at something you came close to, never seeing again. I stood back and let her do it. Then she turned to me and said, the wallpaper by the stairs is peeling. Has that always been like that? I said, probably. She said, we're fixing it. I said, yes, ma'am. That evening she made soup, chicken and vegetables from scratch, the way she's made it since before I knew her. Arnold came by and had a bowl. Carolyn sent over a bottle of wine with a note that said she'd been saving it for a good outcome. Dr. Nash, who Gloria had apparently charmed completely during her recovery, sent flowers. We sat at the kitchen table in Millhaven, Ohio, and we ate. The radiator clicked in the corner the way it does every fall when the temperature drops. The kitchen smelled like broth and the candle on the windowsill. I've thought about Stuart a lot since then. I don't have a clean answer, and I've stopped looking for one. He's my son. I coached his Little League team for 2 seasons, even though I don't know much about baseball. I have a photo in the top drawer of my nightstand, Stuart at 8 years old, sitting on my shoulders out at Lake Kiever, holding a fishing rod with both hands, squinting into the sun, grinning like he'd invented the whole concept of Saturday morning. I know exactly where that photo is. I haven't moved it. I can't explain what he became when I wasn't watching. I've stopped trying. What I know is this. I came home on a Thursday because a storm system came through and the forecast looked bad, and Arnold and I agreed it wasn't worth the drive. That's the whole reason. If the weather had held, I'd have been at Lake Kiever for 3 more days. Dr. Nash told me that if Gloria had gone another 72 hours, her kidneys wouldn't have made it. A weather forecast saved my wife's life. I can't control who my son decided to be in the dark. I only get to control what I do when the lights come on. I came home. I stayed calm. I let the law do what it's built to do. And Gloria is in the next room right now telling me the wallpaper she picked out isn't the right shade of white and that I need to call the supplier back first thing Monday. I'm going to call the supplier. That's enough for me. People always think the dangerous ones are the strangers. They never think to check the person who knows which mug you drink from every morning. The scariest betrayal isn't the kind that screams at you. It's the kind that shows up with a smile, sets a plant by the door, and has been counting your days for months.